On today's video, I want to give you 5 tips for setting up your Fujifilm camera so that it is a little bit more like your DSLR. Now let's get things straight. We moved away from DSLR because we don't want DSLR anymore. So I'm not saying we're going to turn it into a DSLR all over again. This video is just to help you adjust to your new mirrorless camera. So let's get started. Tip number 1, exposure preview white balance setting. You need to get to know this setting. Let me give you 2 examples real quick. Let's say you're shooting a reception, a wedding reception, and it's kind of dark, ambient light, and you're using your flashes off camera, or you're using bounce flash on top of your camera. So you go, you set your exposure, you make it look good, but then you notice the settings that you have for your flash, it looks good when you take the picture, but the screen is black while you're not taking pictures. While you're trying to look and get stuff in focus, the screen's black, or it's super dark. Well, this is because the EVF is always showing you the exposure preview. Now, there's no way for the EVF to know that that flash is gonna be so bright that it's going to overcome all the darkness. So you're stuck looking at the dark setting that you have everything metered for. Now, another situation this might come up is if you're in a studio setting and you're doing maybe headshots, anything with off-camera flash, and you have your settings dialed in and it looks good. Usually when you're using strobes, your settings are gonna make it so that you might have a dark or a black viewfinder while you're trying to focus and compose. But then when you take the picture, bam, that strobe fires and then you've got enough exposure. So a studio setting might be another situation that you find yourself in. There's probably more, but those are the 2 that I run into: wedding receptions, and if I'm ever doing off-camera flash. So to make this work, you need to go into our settings. Let's go down to the wrench icon, go to screen setup, and let's scroll down till we see preview exp/WB in manual mode. And let's click on that. So basically this setting allows you to turn off the exposure preview. So once you turn that setting off, the camera will stop showing you what the current exposure will look like, and it will simply normalize your EVF. It'll bring the EVF up to a brightness where you can see everything. Now you'll notice there's 3 options. It's not just on or off. You have preview exposure and white balance, preview white balance, or just turn it off completely. So let's say in that wedding reception, you know your flashes are gonna be 5,600 kelvins, but with the way it looks in there, setting your white balance to 5,600, it makes everything look really orange, or it just doesn't look that good. That's fine. You can leave your white balance at 5,600 and you simply turn this setting off, and it will normalize both your exposure and the white balance look. It'll give you a more natural look, while at the same time keeping your setting of 5,600 kelvins for the white balance. Now, if the white balance does look good and you want to preview that, you can choose to just preview the white balance. So it will show you your current white balance, but it will ignore the exposure settings and set everything to a normal level so you can see all the time. Now, something you do not want to do is forget that this is turned on. That can lead to problems the next day when you go outside, take a picture of your dog running around the backyard, and everything is blown out when you take the picture, but it looks fine through the EVF. I don't understand. Yeah, so actually for my XH1s that I use for weddings, I actually have that assigned to this button right here. I never use my exposure lock, my exposure lock. I never use that. So I actually have it assigned to that button so that while I'm shooting, I can cycle through those 3. So that's where I like to have it on my XH1. If you're using an X Pro 2, an XT30, an XE1, it really doesn't matter. This setting is the same in all Fuji cameras, as far as I know. I've had everything from like an XT1 and an XE2 up to an XH1. So on X Pro 2, XT20, XT10, it's all the same setting. And you can go into the menu and assign this feature to one of your function buttons if it's something that you need to switch in and out of a lot. Tip number 2. Now, something that gets talked about a lot with these Fuji cameras is that they've been using the same battery forever. And the battery's not really the best, right? Especially compared to some of the newer offerings from other manufacturers. I find that people can tend to over exaggerate how bad it is. And actually something that I learned from watching one of Tony Northrup video. I know, he's a very polarizing character. But I will give my man props because in one of his videos talking, I think about the X-T2, he recommended that you just switch the camera off between shots. It starts up super fast, you're not likely to miss a moment doing that. And as soon as I heard him say that, I tried that at my very next wedding, just shutting the camera off. Now, coming from Canon with a 5D3 with 2 batteries in it, I left that thing on all day. Battery never ran out, no problem. But even using an XH1 or an X-T2 with a grip, you probably will burn through your batteries if you leave it on all the time. So if you just get into the habit of switching that thing off every time you're done taking a picture, and I'm talking about weddings, and this method still works for me. You turn it off when you're not taking pictures. Now, if you anticipate that something's going to happen, leave it on for a small stretch. But I'm talking like we take family photos after the ceremony. Once we get the shot, turn the camera off. Let's get to organizing the next group of people. Turn the camera on, take our shots. Once we're done, turn the camera off, and so on and so forth through the rest of the day. And I find that with 3 batteries in my XH1 or my XT2 or my X Pro 2, I never really even make it to the 3rd battery. On my second camera, my main camera will get to about 1/4 into that 3rd battery. But you can definitely last a day shooting well over 1,000 images in a 12-hour span with just 3 batteries. I know, it's still not the best, but it's better than leaving it on all day and burning through 3 batteries in like an hour. Tip number 3. Now, the first thing you notice when you switch from DSLR to mirrorless is the viewfinder, right? The electronic viewfinder. I personally love it. It's changed how I shoot. I no longer have to check my images. I take less images throughout the day. For video, it's amazing. But let's talk about something that can trip you up if you're coming from DSLR to mirrorless about the viewfinder. Now, by default, at least I think it's by default, or maybe all of them, will come with the EVF Brightness set to auto. Now, right away, this can cause a bunch of problems. So let's say you're taking pictures and you're moving from dark parts of the room to light parts of the room, or from shade to broad daylight, stuff like that. And you just think your photos look great because you're looking at them in the viewfinder, and no matter what you do, you're unstoppable. Your photos look amazing. You can't take a bad photo. And then later you get back and you're reviewing them and you're saying like, why are these so dark? I thought it was bright. It looked good in the viewfinder. Now, a common cause for that is your EVF brightness being set to auto. And it's just like it sounds like. It will automatically increase or decrease the brightness of the EVF. Now, the problem is that brightness of the EVF has nothing to do with your exposure settings. So you might think it's bright, it's perfectly exposed, but then when you review images later, or as you're taking the pictures and you see that image review, it's darker or it's brighter, you don't understand what the heck is going on. It's very likely due to the auto EVF. Now, for me personally, I set this to 0 and I leave it at 0. Unless I'm shooting a lot in broad daylight, those days when it's just super bright, then I might crank it up to like 3 or 4 or something like that. But you got to remember to turn it back down. So again, we're going to go back into the menu to the wrench icon, screen settings, and it's right there, EVF brightness. So if it's set to auto, try setting it to 0 or 1 or -1, something like that, so that you can get an idea of how bright your image actually is. Now, it also helps if you have your histogram there in your live view. So once you do that, play around with it, see how it looks, and it should be easier for you to gauge whether you're getting enough exposure or not. Tip number 4. So if you have a Fujifilm camera that has dual card slots, you're probably going to want to use those dual card slots. Now, I know when I was shooting Canon, they made it pretty straightforward. You told it, I want RAWs on card 1, JPEGs on card number 2, RAWs on both, JPEGs on both. Now, Fujifilm has gone and kind of reinvented the wheel here. So depending on what you want to do, it's very easy to think that you're writing a certain format to a certain card, but you might not actually be doing that. So let me walk you through this real quick. The first place you want to check is in your menu under IQ. Now, if you notice there, image quality, we can select RAW. So let's imagine you want to write RAW to both cards. This is pretty simple. You would select RAW under that image quality tab, Then you would go down to your wrench setting. We go down to Save Data Setup. Go to Card Setting for Still Image. And we would select Backup. So now we are writing RAW files to both cards 1 and 2. Now let's say you want to do RAW to one card, JPEG to another card. That's a pretty common setup. And you might think, now when we're there in the Save Data setup, under Card Slot Setting, you can see there's an option there for RAW/JPEG, and you might think, yeah, I'll just pick that, no problem, now I'm good to go. But then if you go back out to your settings, you'll see that you're actually still writing RAW files to both cards. Now why is that? Well, it's because we need to go back into the IQ setting. So let's start at IQ. We want to pick Fine plus RAW. So now we're telling the camera, hey, I want to shoot a fine JPEG and a RAW file. Now we go back into Save Data Setup, Card Slot Setting, select RAW plus JPEG. Now when we go out, we see that we're writing a RAW file to card 1, a JPEG to card number 2. So you have to switch both of those settings if you want to write RAWs and JPEGs. Now if you want to write JPEGs to both cards, you would have to again go into IQ, Image Quality, select Fine, and now if you notice, it will give you JPEGs to both cards, even though in the Save Data Card Slot Setting page, you have RAW and JPEG selected. So the moral of the story is you definitely want to make sure that you have your settings straight before you go shooting an entire day. You might think that you have RAW and JPEG selected, but if you haven't changed it in the IQ menu, you're going to be shooting only RAWs or only JPEGs until you pick Fine or Normal plus RAW. So thanks Fujifilm for making it very straightforward and obvious for all of us. Tip number 5. So now let's talk about switching to Fujifilm from a DSLR. Now, maybe you picked Fujifilm because you love the top dials, you love being able to change your settings right up here and it's so cool. Or maybe if you're like me, you didn't really switch for that stuff, you just kind of think, that's kind of cool, but I really didn't have a problem with the way I changed stuff on my Canon, on my DSLR. Now if you feel that way, you can actually set up your Fujifilm camera to work a little bit more like your DSLR might have. Currently the way that I shoot is I use this wheel, the rear command dial, to change my shutter speed. The front one I will use to change my ISO sometimes, but I usually leave it in auto ISO. Now if this sounds like something you want to do, I'll show you how to do it real quick. Now the first step is that we want to set our top dial for the shutter speed to the letter T. See that? T for time? I don't know what it stands for. If you know, put it in the comments. And then I'll make a whole new video and pretend like I knew the whole time. Now, you guessed it, we're going back into the menu under the wrench icon. Now this time we're heading to button/dial setting. Click on that. Now let's go down to command dial setting. Here you see we can have the front dial control both the f-stop or the ISO. I'll show you how to do that in a second. And if we scroll down to the rear dial, we have it controlling the shutter speed. Now, maybe your DSLR was different. Maybe you want to flip-flop these two and have the shutter speed on the front and the aperture on the back. If you want to do that, you would just flip-flop these items in the menu. So once we have it set up that way, if you want to control your f-stop with the front control dial, you need to set your lens to the automatic aperture setting. So if you have one of these ones with the actual ring, swing it all the way over to A. And if you have one of the other ones, you just flick the switch, change it to automatic. Now, when you go to spin your front dial, it should control your aperture. If it doesn't, if you start seeing your ISO move around, you want to press that front control dial. You should see a little icon come up on your screen that says that it's switching back and forth between ISO and f-stop. So once you have the f-stop selected, then you can move your f-stop with the front dial. Now, if when you press that, the little switching icon is not coming up, what you need to do with your ISO dial is move it to the A setting. A for automatic. Once you move your ISO dial to automatic, then when you press the button, it should switch back and forth. So let's switch into the ISO setting. Now when we scroll with our front dial, we're controlling the ISO. So it actually makes it very quick, and it feels more DSLR-ish if that's your preference. So you can switch back and forth, control your f-stop. Then you need to change your ISO, just tap that button and start scrolling away. You need to control your shutter speed, and it's all here on the rear control dial. So for me, that feels a little more like how my Canon was. And I'll tell you what, I go back and forth throughout the wedding day. There's some times when I know my ISO is gonna be this. It's gonna be this for the entire ceremony, the entire reception. So I will use the dial and scroll to that ISO and just leave it, lock it in place and be done with it so that I don't accidentally hit it. Same thing with the aperture. Usually I just leave it at 2.8 because I shoot almost everything wide open. Now the shutter speed I will usually leave on the rear command dial. But again, there's sometimes during the reception, or if I'm using off-camera flash, that I know I'm just gonna lock the shutter at either 1/60th or 2/50th, so I'll actually use the wheel. But it's nice to know that there's options. That's the main takeaway. If you wanna shoot it the Fujifilm way, go right ahead. But if you do wanna make it feel a little more DSLR-ish, you can switch over to using the command dials. So there you have it. Those are 5 tips to get you acclimated to your new Fujifilm camera. If you found any of these tips helpful, or even if you didn't, go ahead and hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you for the next video. Peace.